The night Walt Hargrove looked me in the eye in front of 14 people who had watched me build his company and said, "Blood runs this company, Reed. Always has. Always will." I did not say a word. Not because I had nothing to say. Because I finally understood something I should have understood years earlier. He had just told me the rules, and the rules meant I had already won, and he did not know it yet. My name is Reed Calloway. I am 51 years old. For 22 years, I ran Hargrove Freight and Logistics out of Fort Wayne, Indiana. Not with my name on the ownership papers, not with a title that matched what I actually did, but with my hands, my judgment, my weekends, my phone calls at midnight, and a dark brown leather notebook that held more of that company's real memory than Walt Hargrove ever bothered to record. When I walked into Hargrove Freight for the first time, the company had 6 trucks, 11 employees, and a rented lot on the south side of Fort Wayne, where the chain-link fence leaned at an angle that made the whole place look like it had already accepted defeat. Walt called it a freight company. I called it a slow bleed. The routes were inefficient. The vendor contracts were outdated. Drivers were sitting too long between loads. Dispatchers were guessing more than planning, and fuel costs were quietly eating every margin alive while Walt talked about pushing harder. I stopped guessing and started measuring. I mapped every route. I timed every delay. I renegotiated vendor agreements one by one, usually over the phone during my lunch hour. Because if I waited for Walt to schedule a meeting, we would all be retired before anything changed. I built the first version of our routing system on my own laptop during weekends. Sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, while my son left toy trucks under my chair and Carol fell asleep watching television in the next room. By year 3, we had our first state transportation contract. By year 8, 40 trucks. By year 15, 3 regional hubs, more than 90 trucks, and a federal contract portfolio worth several $1,000,000 annually. Walt liked to stand at company dinners and tell people he had built Hargrove Freight from the ground up. I never corrected him at those dinners, but every dispatcher in that building knew the truth. Every driver who had ever called me at 2 in the morning with a problem. Every procurement officer who asked for me by name when renewal season came around. The company Walt bragged about at family gatherings was not the company he had built. It was the company I had carried. Then Tad Hargrove came home with an MBA. That was how everyone said it. Not like the announcement of a colleague joining the team, more like a coronation. Like the degree itself was the credential, and the last name was the confirmation. Tad was 32 years old, sharp suit, expensive watch, polished shoes that had clearly never crossed a muddy loading yard at 5 in the morning when a federal delivery window was closing, and 3 drivers were running late. He walked into Hargrove talking about operational pivots and value chain optimization, but he could not read a load board without asking someone to explain the columns. He did not know the difference between a dry van rate and a flatbed quote. He had never calmed a driver stranded outside Chicago in a December snowstorm. Never explained a compliance delay to a federal procurement officer who had 3 other carriers on speed dial. Never sat with dispatch past midnight untangling a route collapse before one missed window turned into 5. Walt asked me to bring him up to speed. So for 14 months, I walked Tad through everything. Every system, every vendor relationship, every federal contract cycle, every client who needed a phone call instead of an email, and every reason why. Every quiet rule that kept freight moving when the paperwork said it should have stopped. He nodded and took notes. Sometimes he repeated my explanations back to me in business school language. Like repackaging my words in different vocabulary transferred the ownership to him. I told myself. Walt was easing him in gradually. I told myself there would eventually be a real conversation about my future in the company, about compensation, about the kind of acknowledgement that matches what someone has actually built. I should have paid more attention to what Walt was not saying. Because 14 months later, I was sitting at that conference table while Walt introduced Tad as the new Chief Operating Officer of Hargrove Freight and Logistics. And then he turned to me and said it. "Blood runs this company, Reed. Always has, always will." 14 people in that room heard it. Dispatchers I had trained from nothing. Managers I had promoted. Account reps who had watched me take calls at midnight to keep their biggest clients from walking. Not one of them looked at me. They all stared at the table because the truth had settled into the room and no one wanted to be near it when it landed. I looked at Walt for a moment. Then I picked up my coffee cup, took a slow sip even though it had gone cold, and set it back down like the sentence had bounced off me. Tad was already shuffling papers. I did not say anything. I let the meeting continue around me. I smiled when it was appropriate. I answered one logistics question from an account rep near the end, as if my whole career had not just been dismissed in 10 words. But something had clarified in me that I had never felt before. For the first time in 22 years, I was not trying to make Walt see me. I was not waiting for the company to recognize what I had given it. I was not believing that loyalty, if carried long enough, would eventually become visible. I was thinking about what I had built. And more importantly, I was thinking about what I still owned. I walked back to my office without a word to anyone, closed the door, sat behind the desk that never had my name on it, and I opened the notebook. Dark brown leather cover. Corners worn soft from 2 decades of being carried from dispatch floors to government bid reviews, from vendor renegotiations to emergency calls at 3 in the morning. I had bought it before my first week. I thought the job would last maybe 3 years. Inside that notebook was the company's real memory. Every federal contact I had built, every vendor relationship I had maintained through calls they never logged on the company server. Every pricing adjustment, every renewal cycle, every procurement officer's direct line, their communication preferences, the small details that separate a carrier who wins contracts from one who loses them over things that never show up in a proposal deck. None of it was on the company server. None of it was in Tad's new binder. None of it had ever been formally documented by Hargrove. I had just been the person who knew it. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and went through the notebook with the kind of attention I had not given it in years. Not reading it like nostalgia. Reading it like a lawyer reviewing documents before a settlement. That was when I found the first thing Walt had forgotten. The 3 largest federal contracts in Hargrove's portfolio were not built around the company name the way Walt probably assumed. Federal transportation relationships are built around compliance records, performance history, and operational continuity, and in all 3 of those contracts, I was listed as the primary operational contact. My name, my number, my email. And in 2 of them, there was specific contract language about operational continuity. Language I had helped draft years earlier to reassure the agencies that the performance they were buying would be backed by a steady, experienced hand. I had written that language to protect Hargrove. I had not understood until that night that it also protected me. Those 3 contracts represented more than $9 million annually combined. Walt had just publicly displaced the person those contracts depended on, without understanding what the continuity clauses meant, without understanding that the people on the other end of those contracts had my name in their files, not his son's. I put the notebook down and sat quietly for a while. Then I went back to the routing system. Walt had never asked about it in any serious way. To him, trucks left the yard and arrived on time because that was what trucks were supposed to do. To Tad, the operation had probably looked like an inherited asset, something that came with the building and would keep running because he now had the title. But the system did not come with the building. I built the first version during my second year, entirely on my own laptop during evenings and weekends, without any company direction, without compensation, without even telling Walt it existed. I updated it every year after that, adding fuel patterns, hub delays, driver availability windows, seasonal traffic data, federal compliance windows, and the small invisible variables that never appear in presentations, but determine whether a route generates margin or burns it. Over 6 years, that system had cut Hargrove's fuel costs by close to 19%. It had given them an edge on nearly every serious bid they submitted. And my original employment agreement contained no intellectual property assignment, no formal transfer, no written ownership claim. Walt's lawyer had drafted a standard employment contract in the early years and never thought ahead far enough to ask what tools the new operations manager might build on his own time. For 22 years, I had let them benefit from something they had never legally acquired. I closed my laptop, I finished my cold coffee, I sat for a long time without writing anything. Then I made one promise to myself. I was not going to burn anything down. Not because Walt deserved mercy, not because Tad had earned a clean exit, but because I had watched enough situations in my career to understand what happens when a person lets anger make decisions. If I walked into that office shouting, Walt would call me unstable. If I threatened anything, he would call me bitter. If I slammed something, he would tell everyone it proved his judgment had been sound. Men like Walt Hargrove always wait for your pain to become proof against you. I was not giving him that. So I took 3 days. I reviewed everything: contracts, notes, systems, vendor relationships, my employment agreement, the federal performance clauses, the routing software. I separated what I had contributed from what I legally owned. I separated what they could take from what had never actually belonged to them. Then I wrote a resignation letter. 2 weeks notice, professional tone, no accusations, no speech, no line about 22 years or loyalty or what the Hargrove name actually owed me, just dates, transition language, and my signature. Before I handed it in, I reached out individually to the federal contacts who had worked directly with me. I did not insult Hargrove. I did not warn them about Tad. I simply let them know I was leaving my role and provided my personal contact information so they would have it on file. That was not revenge. That was documentation. Scott Langford had called me twice in 4 years. Not aggressively. Not like a recruiter circling a competitor's employee. Just a message every year or so. He ran Midland Carrier Group out of Columbus, smaller than Hargrove but growing steadily, with a reputation in the industry for promoting the people who actually understood operations rather than inheriting them. Reed, the offer is still there whenever you're ready. I had ignored him both times because loyalty can make a man deliberately deaf to what he already knows is coming. I thought if I stayed long enough, solved enough problems, kept the freight moving well enough, Walt would eventually admit what his own employees already understood. I called Scott back 3 days after that conference room. We met at a barbecue place outside Columbus. No performance, no suits. Just 2 people who understood freight talking over brisket and black coffee. Scott asked about routing margins, federal compliance cycles, hub efficiency, dispatcher load, fuel recovery data, and contract continuity. He did not ask me to explain what a dry van was. Then he made the offer. Senior Vice President of Operations, $195,000 per year, 8% profit sharing, authority over 3 regional hubs, and a sentence that stayed with me longer than the salary figure. If you built systems on your own time and your own equipment, we acquire them properly. Fair valuation, written credit. Your name stays on the work. For 22 years, Hargrove had used my work the way you use air, as if it had always been there and would always be there, and no one needed to say thank you to the air. Scott recognized its value in one conversation. I accepted the offer before my coffee went cold. Hargrove did not fall apart the morning I left. That would have been too clean, too cinematic. Real damage in a company is rarely dramatic at first. The trucks still rolled. The phones still rang. Dispatch still opened before sunrise. Tad walked through the building with his legal pad and his new title, trying to carry himself like a man who knew what was underneath him. But freight has a way of exposing gaps that pride covers over. The first problems were small. A route through Columbus ran 40 minutes longer than it should have because nobody had adjusted for a construction pattern I had been tracking for weeks. A driver sat too long between loads because Tad did not understand a pairing logic I had built into the system years earlier. A vendor pushed back on a rate that I normally handled with one phone call, and instead of one call, it became 6 people on an email chain that should have never involved more than 2. Then the federal contacts went quiet. Not hostile, just careful. The kind of professional silence that means someone is reviewing their options without telling you yet. Tad introduced himself on renewal calls with every polished phrase his degree had given him. But those people were not looking for polish. They were looking for confidence, for operational history, for someone who understood what happened when one missed compliance window became a contract flag, and a contract flag became a carrier review. Tad had the title. He did not have the memory, and without the routing system, without the handwritten knowledge in that notebook, without the relationships built through years of answered calls and solved crises, Hargrove started moving like a company operating from memory it no longer had. For 22 years, I had been the quiet structure underneath everything they took credit for. Once I stopped carrying it, the weight was finally visible. At Midland, nobody asked me to justify my presence in the room. They gave me the room and expected me to work. I listened more than I talked in the early weeks. I sat with dispatchers, reviewed route histories, fuel reports, delay patterns, compliance records. Midland was already a solid operation. It did not need rescuing. It needed sharpening, and that I knew how to do. By the 4th week, we began integrating the routing system. This time it was done correctly. Legal documentation, fair valuation, written ownership transfer with my name on the record. After 22 years of watching Hargrove treat my work as a company asset that had materialized from nowhere, sitting at a table where someone valued it properly, felt like having something returned to me that I had not realized I was missing. The numbers moved quickly after that. Fuel efficiency improved. Dispatch errors dropped. On-time delivery rates climbed enough that Scott included them directly in Midland's federal bid package. When the Department of Transportation opened renewal bids for the Midwest Corridor contract, Midland entered with cleaner performance data, stronger route modeling, and an operational history that could prove what it promised. Hargrove bid too. Of course they did. But they did not have the system. They did not have the contacts who trusted the person on the other end of the call. They did not have the man who had quietly made every number in their federal record look the way it did. Midland won the contract, $12 million over 3 years. I found out later that one of the federal procurement officers had asked Tad a simple question during a renewal call. Who is handling operational continuity now that Reed Calloway has left the company? Tad gave his title. the officer asked again. Not for a title, for a name and a track record. That was when the confidence started leaving Tad's voice. The call from Tad came on a Tuesday afternoon, almost 6 weeks after I had left. I was at my desk reviewing Midland's hub efficiency reports when my phone showed a Fort Wayne number I had not saved. I let it go to voicemail. A few minutes later, I played the message. 4 minutes long. His voice had none of the boardroom composure from the meeting, no strategic framing, no MBA vocabulary smoothing the edges, just pressure, thinly wrapped in casual language. 2 federal account renewals were not progressing well. Some procurement contacts were not responding to outreach. He wondered if I might be willing to help informally with a few calls, just to smooth things over. Then he said, the part that told me everything I needed to hear. Dad does not know I am calling. I sat with that message for a moment. Not because it gave me pleasure to hear the desperation in it, but because I wanted to fully recognize what I was hearing. After 22 years of being told, in 100 quiet ways, that my work was just the expected output of my role, Tad Hargrove was calling me from a number I did not have saved to ask me to quietly save his inheritance. I called him back the same afternoon. My voice was even. No sarcasm, no lecture. I told him I would be glad to assist in a formal consulting capacity. My external logistics rate was $350 per hour, billed in 2-hour minimums, with a 3-session retainer paid up front. I said I could have an agreement drafted by the end of the week. There was a pause on his end that lasted longer than it needed to. Then he said he would think about it. He never called back. Walt called 5 times over the following month. I listened to each message once and left them in my voicemail folder like files I might need later. The first message sounded controlled and businesslike. The second had an edge to it. By the fourth, he was talking about obligation and what I owed the company that had given me a career. That one almost made me close my eyes. The fifth message used the word loyalty twice. I called him back on a Sunday morning, sitting on my back porch with a cup of coffee that was actually still warm. He answered immediately, like he had been waiting all week. Before I could say anything, he started. Restructuring, consulting arrangements, compensation packages, what this situation was doing to the family. I let him finish without interrupting. When he stopped, I waited 1 beat. Then I said quietly, Walt, you told that room that blood runs your company. Remember that? He was silent. You were right, I said, and I finally went back to mine. He did not answer. Maybe it was the first time in a very long time that Walt Hargrove had been in a conversation and had nothing ready to say. I did not wait for him to find something. I thanked him for calling and told him I wished the company well. Then I hung up, set my phone on the armrest, and drank the rest of my coffee. That was not a dramatic moment. It was not a victory speech. It was just a door closing cleanly on its hinges, the way things close when you have had long enough to decide you are ready. 3 months later, a reporter from a Midwest logistics trade publication called Midland, looking for a story about the federal contract win. She wanted to understand how a regional carrier had improved fuel efficiency, reduced dispatch errors, and sharpened its federal bid so quickly. We talked for 30 minutes about routing methodology, compliance windows, hub coordination, and the system I had been building and refining for years. When the article ran, it named me directly as the architect behind Midland's operational improvement. There was a photograph. My name appeared in the headline, attached to the work. Scott left a framed copy on my desk before I came in Monday morning. He did not make an announcement. He did not call anyone into a conference room. He just placed it there, where I would see it first thing. Because at Midland, recognition was not something you had to ask for. I stood there for a while, holding that frame. 22 years at Hargrove, and my name had never appeared in print in connection with what I had built. 3 months at Midland, and it was in the headline. I set the frame on my desk where it would be visible from my door, went and poured a coffee, and came back to start the morning's work. Carol had heard the news about Hargrove through her mother before I said anything. Walt had sold 40% of the company to a regional competitor. 40% of the business he used to describe as untouchable. 40% of the name he had protected so fiercely that he used it to justify displacing the man who had kept it viable for more than 2 decades. He stepped back from day-to-day operations shortly after. Officially, it was retirement. Everyone who had worked in that building understood what it actually was. Tad remained in a reduced role. That part I genuinely did not celebrate. He had wanted the chair and the authority and had not understood the weight underneath them. A company is not held together by a last name. It is held together by judgment, relationships, systems, and people who know what to do when the plan stops working cleanly. Walt had mistaken inheritance for competence. Tad had mistaken position for experience. And both of them had looked at my silence for 22 years and decided it meant I would keep carrying the load without condition. They were not wrong about me staying quiet. They were wrong about why. I stayed quiet because I was watching. Because I was building something they never thought to look at carefully. Because the kind of patience that comes from real confidence does not need to announce itself. Their consequences arrived without me doing a single thing except leave. 2 years on from that conference room, I still think about it occasionally. Not with bitterness, not with the kind of backward anger that keeps a person from moving. I think about it because that was the day the confusion finally lifted. The difference between being useful and being valued. For 22 years, I confused them. I thought if I solved enough problems and carried enough weight and stayed loyal through enough difficult seasons, the recognition would eventually close the gap on its own. It does not always work that way. Sometimes the room you are in was never designed to see you clearly. Sometimes you have to walk out of it before your own work becomes visible to you. My son Clay called from college after the article ran. He tried to keep his voice casual, but I could hear the pride underneath it, and I let him talk for longer than I needed to, because it felt good to be witnessed by someone who understood what the years had cost. Carol and I had dinner that evening, just the two of us at the kitchen table with no agenda, and at some point she said, "You should have left 3 years ago." She was not wrong. But I told her I was not sure I would have been ready 3 years ago. Sometimes you have to see the door clearly before you understand it was never locked. So here is what I carry from all of it. Know what you own, not what you were assigned.
Not what someone told you was yours. What you actually built with your own hands, your own time, your own judgment, on equipment that was yours. Document it, protect it, understand where it lives and who has access to it, and what agreements or absence of agreements govern it.
Build relationships as if the organization behind you might not always be there, because it might not. Do not wait for people to value what you have given them before they need you to keep giving it. They often cannot see the value until it is absent, and by then, the valuation is yours to set. And when the day comes to leave, do not leave angry. Leave prepared. Leave clean. Leave with what is genuinely yours, and let the people who misread your patience discover exactly what they were relying on without understanding it. If this story stayed with you, if you have ever worked somewhere that needed everything you had but never quite got around to saying so, leave a comment below. Would you have walked away sooner, or would you have stayed until the moment became undeniable? Subscribe for more stories about people who carried things quietly, left without drama, and let the truth do the rest of the work. I did not destroy Hargrove Freight. I did not need to. I simply stopped standing underneath it. And when I finally stepped away, the building did not fall because I had attacked it. It settled because, for the first time in 22 years, I was no longer holding it up.